Okay, time to deweight the machine. We're getting ready to apply Gesso Dye, and a couple things. We just made a very basic saw cut. So when you're saw cutting, you don't want to have one color bleed onto an adjoining area. So for example, we're going to leave these areas uncolored. So just a quick method of masking. I'll use blue or green painter's tape. Don't ever use a high build tape like duct tape. But one of the keys is to make sure that this edge of the tape right here touches this edge of the saw cut. And the reason for that is then you fold it down in there. So you can just take your take a straight edge and fold the tape down in there. And just by folding it in there like you see that, it prevents it from bleeding and wicking up underneath. Once we have the saw cut all taped off, we come back with our masking plastic right over the top of that and then unfold it. And that's a sure way to prevent bleeding or contamination of the other side. Now, here is a mistake I'll see sometimes with contractors out on a project is they spray the dye too heavy and they don't clean any dye residue, and then when you go to your next grit, it smears onto the adjoining area. So do yourself a favor. A lot of people think that the dye penetrates all the way. Make sure you clean it. Just do yourself a favor, especially if you have uncolored sections. Once you've dyed it, clean it with an auto scrubber, a damp mop, a rag if it's small, a sponge, whatever. Doesn't take a lot of water. Just get that residue off before you go to the next step. Also, the type of sprayer that you use is very, very important. It has to be acetone or solvent resistant. And what's really important is the type of conical tip that you use, meaning a cone tip. You want the dye to just fog out there in a mist. You don't want to have a pattern where the orifice is so large that it really dispenses too much dye out on the surface. So we'll get this masked up and show you how to apply the dye. Okay, to recap, we have brought this floor up to a 200 grit pad, if you recall. So now we've cleaned the surface and we're going to apply our first coat of dye. Understand, every concrete is different, and even these the self-leveling overlays like Param 6000 sets at different rates. So just because we're doing it at this sequence doesn't necessarily mean that you have to do it. I've found through the years that this is a great sequence to apply color at right now after the 200 grit. Some will like to do it after the 100 grit. To me, the 200 grit is so aggressive it takes too much color off, so I find that this is a good balance, all right? A couple things, just the basics of staining or dyeing. Number one, use an acid-resistant, a solvent-resistant sprayer. And you always want to have a bucket. I'll see guys out on a job site just walk right across the job like this, and all of a sudden their sprayer starts to drip, and now you'll see that in the floor, and it won't go away, even after you polish it. So you want to try to always start the tip of your spray in the bucket, and then go right out onto the slab. Now, for demonstration purposes, I'm going to show you here. This is actually a drip-free sprayer, so watch this. When I let off, you don't see it dripping, which is huge if you're out on a big job and you have to stop for whatever reason and you don't have a bucket. It's really nice to have this non-drip sprayer. Okay, I'm going to come right out of the bucket. Notice how I'm fogging it on. I don't spray directly on the saw cut. I'm always spraying away from this edge so we don't get that bleeding. Once we let this set for several minutes, we'll come back and just run a damp sponge over it. Once that's dry, it's on to the next step, which is our 400 grit. Back into the bucket. And that's the basics of how you should be applying your acetone dye. Now, I have done several projects successfully without a saw cut. So you don't always have to saw cut like we've done here. That's a traditional way. Then typically what we would do after it's all done and polished, we would fill that saw cut with a sanded tile grout, perhaps in a contrasting color so it becomes an aesthetic thing. It looks very nice. But you can mask off your designs, and if you use this type of sprayer with the technique that I just showed you, it will not wick up underneath, okay? Then of course you could reverse the masking onto where you just dyed and do a different color if you chose to. So, all right, we can lightly sponge this off, okay? And then we'll remove the masking and move on to our 400 grit. We've applied our first application of our solvent dye. We removed the masking. We've kind of cleaned off the residue. Now if you look at the bottom of the machine, we have the red pad on, which is our 400 grit. The way that this is shaping up, we'll probably start to see a little bit of a polish. Typically in the industry, what we refer to as the wow factor is usually after the 800 grit. That's when the floor starts to pop. But I'm kind of anticipating we might see a shine after this grit. So let's get busy on our 400 grit and see what we get. Once again, speed of the machine up 1 notch. Now a quick observation. I'm not just going to run into the dye. I'm just going to go ahead. You can leave that on. I'm just going to go right over it and see if we're getting any swirling. In other words, any bleed over. So if I look, we've done a thorough job of cleaning. Rather than just go to town and find out that it's bleeding for whatever reason, just do a small test like I showed you. We've run our 400 grit, we've remasked, and now it's time for our second application of the Gesso dye. Here we go. Notice how it's misting on. By applying the 2 coats like this, it's just going to give us nice color intensity. And when we come over here to the end, remember the tip goes directly right back into the bucket. All right, so we'll give this a quick cleaning like we did to get that little bit of dye residue off, and unveil it, and then run right over to our 800 grit, and that's gonna give us that wow factor, and we'll start to see a little bit of a shine and a gloss. All right, we're ready for our next step. We've applied our second application of the Gesso dye. We've, since it's such a small area, we just sponged it off, and then we took a dry cloth and just wiped the residue off. Now it's time to apply our Hermetex colloidal silica. Basically, it's a 4-to-1 ratio, 4 parts water to 1 part Hermetex. And if you look, I brought it up in an earlier video, these little measure cups are really brilliant because it already gives you the ratios, the mixed ratios. So if you look here, it says 4-to-1, and what we're going to do is we've filled the water on the left-hand column to the 3 level. Now all we're going to do is we're going to take our Hermetex and we're going to fill it up to this level on the 3 side, and that gives you a 4-to-1 ratio. We're going to mix that just briefly with the stir stick, and then we're going to apply it with a pump sprayer. Now because of the fineness of this material, you can simply just spray it on. It doesn't really require agitating or massaging it in. So you can just spray it on, and we're going to let it set for 30 minutes and then come back, and we're going to go to our next step, which is our 800 grit. And this is where we should start to finally see a pretty good shine on it. And then we'll follow that up with our 1500 grit. And after that, put our topical protectant on and give that a burnish, and we should have a really, really beautiful beautiful floor using our Param 6000. So now obviously on a much larger job, I'd be using a big sprayer, you know, a 2 to 3 gallon sprayer, not this little one. But for this demonstration, this will work just fine. I'm going to always check the stream of my spray first, and it looks like it's spraying just fine. All right, here we go. You can see how it's darkening the substrate. So this is going to help harden and densify our overlayment, and it's going to also contribute to giving us that nice shine that we're after. Notice how beautiful that glass is when it's wet. Just really pretty.